The pilum was a javelin commonly used by the Roman army in ancient times. It was generally about 2 meters long overall, consisting of an iron shank about 7 millimeters in diameter and 60 centimeters long with pyramidal head. The shank was joined to the wooded shaft by either a socket or a flat tang. Design: the total weight of a pilum was between 2 and 5 kilograms, with the versions produced during the earlier Republican era being slightly heavier than those produced in the later Empire era. The iron shank was the key to the function of the pilum. The weapon had a hard pyramidal tip, but the shank was made of softer iron. This softness would cause the shank to bend after impact, thus rendering the weapon useless to the enemy who might throw it back. However, there are many cases where the whole shank was hardened, making the pilum more suitable as a close-quarters melee weapon, which also made it useful for enemy soldiers to pick it up and throw it back. More importantly, if the pilum struck a shield, it might embed itself, and thus the bending of the shank would force the enemy to discard it, as they might waste time trying to pull it out in the middle of combat. Even if the shank did not bend, the pyramidal tip still made it difficult to pull out. Most other javelins of the time were unable to penetrate a shield. By contrast, since the pyramidal tip of a pilum was wider than the rest of the shank, once it penetrated a shield, it left behind a hole larger than the rest of the shank, and it could move through the shield with little resistance, stabbing the soldier. The length of the shank and its depth of penetration also made it hard to pull out of a shield even if it failed to bend. If the bearer of the shield was charging and a pilum penetrated the shield, the end of the heavy shaft of the pilum would hit the ground, holding the shield in place. On some pilum there was a spike on the end of the shaft which made it easier to dig into the ground. Pilum were divided into two models, heavy and light. Pictorial evidence suggests that some versions of the weapon were weighted by a lead ball to increase penetrative power, but archaeological specimens of this design variant are not so far known. Recent experiments have shown pilum to have a range of approximately 33 meters, although the effective range is up to 15–20 m. An angon was a similar weapon used in late Roman and post-Roman times. Tactics: legionaries of the late Republic and early Empire often carried two pilum, with one sometimes being lighter than the other. Standard tactics called for Roman soldiers to throw one of them at the enemy, just before charging to engage with the gladius. However, Alexander Zmodikov has argued that the Roman infantry could use pilum at any stage in the fighting. The effect of the pilum throw was to disrupt the enemy formation by attrition and by causing gaps to appear in its protective shield wall. Pilum could also be used in hand-to-hand combat. One documented instance of this occurred at the siege of ALll, and another during Marcus Antonius's Parthian campaign. Additionally, pilum could be employed as a thrusting implement and a barrier against cavalry charges. Some pilum had small hand guards, to protect the wielder if he intended to use it as a melee weapon, but it does not appear that this was common. Vegetius commentary. The late Roman writer Vegetius, in his work De Re Militari, wrote, "As to the missile weapons of the infantry, they were javelins headed with a triangular sharp iron, 11 inches or a foot long, and were called piles. When once fixed in the shield it was impossible to draw them out, and when thrown with force and skill, they penetrated the cuirass without difficulty." And later in the same work, "They had likewise two other javelins, the largest of which was composed of a staff 5 feet and a half long and a triangular head of iron 9 inches, 230 millimeters long. This was formerly called the pilum, but now it is known by the name of spiculum. The soldiers were particularly exercised in the use of this weapon, because when thrown with force and skill it often penetrated the shields of the foot and the cuirasses of the horse. It may be argued that a short iron shaft has very few confirmations from archaeology. Vegetius is writing about a 1-foot iron shaft because at Vegetius' time the pilum had disappeared and been replaced by similar shorter weapons such as the plumbati or the above-mentioned spiculum. Results of experimental archaeology. Thanks in part to experimental archaeology, it is generally believed that the pilum's design evolved to be armor-piercing. The pyramidal head would punch a small hole through an enemy shield, allowing the thin shank to pass through and penetrate a distance sufficient to hit the man behind it. The thick wooden shaft provided the weight behind the punch. In one description, one of the two iron nails that held the iron shaft in place was replaced with a weak wooden pin that would break on impact, causing the shaft to twist sideways. Gaius Marius is sometimes given credit for this modification. It has been argued that later pila were constructed so that the iron shank would bend on impact. Having penetrated a shield through a small hole and its shank having bent, such a pilum would now be more difficult to remove, and, of course, impossible to throw back. Further complications and injury could ensue if the understandably reluctant enemy did not discard his precious shield quickly enough, as there would be a great press from the men behind him. Opinion among archaeologists once held that the main function of the shank was to disable both shields and the pilum itself by bending, but it is now thought that the pilum was a form of personal artillery designed simply to provide a massive counter-shock against any charging foe, and, as necessary, turn any legionary into a spearman. See also: pole weapon, javelin, volutum, lance, spiculum, Roman military personal equipment, spear, projectile, lance, aster. Gallery. Notes. References. External links: Samnite Proto-Pila and Early Roman Pila, the Pilum, the Roman Spear, Collene's Roman Legion, Lance/Spear/Pilum/Catapult Points, www.romanlegions.info, Archaeological discovery of a Pilum, Ica Museum de Cap de Cavalleria.